This episode is brought to you by LifeLock. It's tax season, and we're all a bit tired of numbers. But here's one you need to hear. $16.5 billion. That's how much the IRS flagged for possible identity fraud last year. Now here's a good number. 100 million. That's how many data points LifeLock monitors every second. If your identity is stolen, they'll fix it. Guaranteed. Save up to 40% your first year at LifeLock.com/podcast. Terms apply.
Hello, this is Simon Brew. I'm the editor of Film Stories magazine, and a very warm welcome to the Film Stories podcast.
Sorry about that. I literally had to fly in from outer space.
Come with me.
And I show you how deep the rabbit hole goes.
And movies that had stories.
That the story just sucks them in.
This is just the beginning.
Stories. We would be honored if you would join us.
Hello and a very warm welcome to Film Stories with Simon Brew. I am Simon Brew, as always, everything you need to know about me. The aim of the podcast, though, well, the title gives it away. I'm here to talk of the stories of film, and I talk about development stories, production stories, behind-the-scenes stories, really, marketing stories, release stories, all those bits and bobs that go to make the films that we know and sometimes love, just that, the films that we know and sometimes love. The films I tend to choose for this podcast have a mainstream leading to them, really. They're films I'm interested in or invested in to some degree. Not interested in punching down, really. Not really interested in snark. If anything, this podcast is a celebration of the fact it's really hard to make a film, and I kind of want to celebrate those who've made it and also try and make it a bit reachable, really, for those of us on the other side. And that's enough preamble, really. I'm going to crack on with the first of the two films I'm going to talk about in this particular episode, going back to 1987. I'm playing a slightly longer clip than usual because I absolutely adore this particular moment. I'll play the clip and we'll come to the story the other side of this.
You know, everything is not an anecdote. You have to discriminate. You choose things that are funny or mildly amusing or interesting. You're a miracle. Your stories have none of that. They're not even amusing accidentally. Honey, I'd like you to meet Del Griffith. He's got some amusing anecdotes for you. Oh, and here's a gun so you can blow your brains out. You'll thank me for it. I could tolerate any insurance seminar. For days, I could sit there and listen to them go on and on with a big smile on my face. They'd say, how can you stand it? And I'd say, 'cause I've been with Del Griffith. I can take anything. And you know what they'd say? They'd say, I know what you mean. The shower curtain ring guy. Whoa. It's like going on a date with a chatty Cathy doll. I expect you to have a little string on your chest, you know, that I pull out and have to snap back. Except I wouldn't pull it out and snap it back. You would. And by the way, you know, when you're telling these little stories, here's a good idea. Have a point. It makes it so much more interesting for the listener.
I mean, it's just majestic, isn't it? That's Steve Martin and John Candy in 1987's Planes, Trains and Automobiles, written and directed by John Hughes, Layla Robbins, Michael McKean, Kevin Bacon, Dylan Baker, Carol Bruce, just some of the others in the cast of this one. And I think it's pretty well known that the story behind Planes, Trains and Automobiles, well, it went back to an experience that John Hughes had in his pre-filmmaking days when he was working in the world of advertising as a copywriter. Now, in that job, he was sent on what should have been a day trip from Chicago to New York, but it would be fair to say, as you probably guessed, it wasn't the steadiest of trips. He was diverted via Phoenix, and something that he should have been able to complete in a day took an awful lot longer. Now, Hughes's movie career was building in the early 1980s, and he'd set up a deal. In 1983, he'd signed a 3-year deal with Universal Pictures, and that deal would go south, really, after the second film, which went on to be The Breakfast Club. So he'd done 16 Candles as part of the deal, which was his directorial debut. The Breakfast Club then followed, and the plan was that Weird Science would be the next of those movies as part of the deal. But Universal hadn't been keen on him directing The Breakfast Club himself, and when he screened a rough cut of the film for executives of the studio, they weren't impressed. They ordered Hughes to complete the editing of the film in Los Angeles rather than rather than far away in Chicago, which Hughes argued had originally been agreed. It's no secret that Hughes shot his films in and around the Chicago area, and the area was particularly special to him. His reputation was as a high maintenance filmmaker, and when Hughes wanted out of the deal in the mid 1980s, Universal was not really arguing that hard against it. And so by the time we get to the mid 1980s, Hughes and his production company instead they inked a deal at Paramount Pictures. Now this deal wouldn't last an awful lot longer, but it did produce some really notable movies: Ferris Bueller's Day Off and She's Having a Baby, and the film we're about to talk about now, Planes, Trains and Automobiles. So Hughes was also notoriously a very fast writer, and it was said that he'd had the first 60 pages of Planes, Trains and Automobiles written out in under a day. And it was a longer script in the end that he put together, which I'll come to shortly. And if you go back to the DVD Blu-ray release of the movie, there is actually a 15-16 minute press conference on there where he talks about his writing process, and he says how when he writes dialogue, he writes fast, hence the speed of the first drafts that he tended to put together. But what he also added in that press conference was that he constantly rewrote his scripts, and in the end we went through about 25-30 drafts of Planes, Trains and Automobiles. But as the story goes, and I think this is pretty well known, he came up with the first draft screenplay for this one in a matter of 3 or 4 days. Then it was a case of who's he going to bring to this film. Now Hughes had loads of films on the go in the 80s. He was writing films faster than he could direct them himself, and so he was always juggling casting, he was juggling projects. But one person he'd always had an eye on, who hadn't yet starred in a John Hughes feature, was Steve Martin. He'd met John Candy too before and was keen to work with him. But the character of Neil in the film, well, that was the one that Hughes saw Martin in. Now Neil is effectively John Hughes in the movie, that he's going through the experiences that Hughes went on that aforementioned trip. When Hughes wrote all this down, he sat and dwelled on that trip for a while, and he bulked the story out, and he brought in a co-traveller character by the name of Dell, and it was a much thicker than usual script for Hughes. It came in at 145 pages apparently, the draft that was sent to Steve Martin. Martin talked in that aforementioned press conference about a couple of key scenes that won him over, including the meltdown moment, and he was very keen to do the job. As Nick de Semmelin wrote a really excellent book on the comedy stars of the 80s called Wild and Crazy Guys, and he quotes Steve Martin in there and saying, Martin said, "At that point in my career, that was the direction I was heading for, more emotional roles. So this was a real breakthrough for me." It was also a breakthrough for John Candy, and this story is relayed in Martin Nelman's book Laughing on the Outside, which is a sort of biography of Candy. Candy got sent the script for the film in 1986, and he said, quote, "I just cried with laughter when I read it. It's like it was written for me, which makes a big difference. I could see the movie in my mind." And so Candy was quickly on board as well. He had to make a small film by the name of Spaceballs first, but this would be his next project. For John Hughes, though, well, the signing of Steve Martin and John Candy in the lead roles certainly changed his plans for this particular movie. And Kirk Honeycutt has written a book, John Hughes, A Life in Film, which I recommend as well. There's quite a few references for this podcast, you might notice. And he talks in there about Hughes obviously writing an awful lot more films than he could direct himself, and how what he did was he passed the scripts on to directors he trusted. So you've got people like Chris Columbus with Home Alone and Only the Lonely, for instance. But also Howard Deutsch, who he got the call, in this case, to do Planes, Trains and Automobiles. Will you direct this for me? Yeah. And this would be part of the Hughes Entertainment deal set up at Paramount Pictures. Now, Hughes was wrapping up the film She's Having a Baby. He was directing that. He wasn't instantly looking to go straight onto another directorial job. There was the small matter of having to edit She's Having a Baby and get that ready for release as well. But when Candy and Martin were cast, John Hughes changed his mind, and he called Deutsch and just asked if he could take the project back. I say asked, I mean, he clearly had the authority to do that. and Hughes, in exchange, said to Dutch, he'll find you another film, and find him another film he did. That movie would go on to be The Great Outdoors, which would be another co-starring role for John Candy as well. But the key creatives were in place for this one, that Hughes was now going to direct based on his own script. Candy and Martin would be in the lead roles. And for the supporting roles in the movie, well, for a start, Candy and Martin would sit in the auditions for some of those other roles as well. But also Hughes called in actors who he was already working with. There was a bit of a repertory company on the go for a lot of John Hughes movies. So Edie McClurg, for instance, was sounded out about Planes, Trains and Automobiles while she was already working on She's Having a Baby. That she got the confirmation of the role shortly after she completed work on that. But Hughes's head was also part in his next film, even while he was making that one. Jeffrey Jones, who would ultimately be cut out of the movie, he was drafted in as well. Kevin Bacon drafted in, and Hughes had this family of actors who he liked to call on, who he knew he could count on. And so with that in mind, Planes, Trains and Automobiles, the cast came together. However, this one was going to be up against a bit of a schedule. That filming began for the movie in February of 1987, and this was going to be a complex shoot. That whereas Hughes ordinarily would make the bulk of his movies in and around one location, or certainly one area, Planes, Trains and Automobiles, by the nature of the story it was looking to tell, was going to have to go right across America. So, come February 1987, the other challenge it was up against was having to hit an end of November 1987 release date. And the reason for that was that Hughes had decided to set this film in and around Thanksgiving, with Steve Martin's character Neil trying to get home for Thanksgiving, finding himself alongside John Candy's character Dell, and both of them trying to complete this journey in time. By January, the movie hadn't started filming. This was an era as well, and I say this often on this podcast, but it's worth reiterating. Film was shot on film. There weren't fast digital editing facilities. It was bulky reels of film. Just the duplication and distribution of the prints would take 2-3 weeks at the end of the process. And so realistically, this movie had to be shot, edited and ready for the start of November. But also it's going to be very, very location driven. There's not an awful lot of interiors in the movie. Although there are clearly some key scenes. There's moments like the argument in the car where the car was actually mounted on a stage, and so they had an awful lot of time there for improvisation and such like, which I'll come to shortly. But filming began in February, which instantly had a knock-on effect for the release of She's Having a Baby. It's worth noting that because John Hughes leapt straight into directing Planes, Trains and Automobiles, the editing of She's Having a Baby had to wait until he was done and dusted with his new film. That's why She's Having a Baby, even though it was shot first, was released afterwards. In fact, it wouldn't see the inside of a cinema until 1988. The locations this particular production, though, were going to cover Los Angeles, Midwest America, New York, Chicago, Los Angeles. It was going the breadth of the country. There was 3 months in the end of physical production planned. And there was a huge script to shoot that Martin, when he received this monster of a screenplay, this 145 pages, queried Hughes, are you going to cut this down? How are you going to cut this down? And then realised, no, he wasn't going to cut it down. And Hughes was planning to shoot every page. Now, if you're unfamiliar, generally it's regarded that 1 page of screenplay equals 1 minute of screen time, just as a rough rule of thumb. That pointed towards a comedy in the region of 2.5 hours. In fact, the first cut, as we're going to discover, would come in a lot longer. And realistically, comedies, halcyon days, needed to come down to about 90 minutes, 100 minutes, and not outstay their welcome. Hughes was about to shoot an awful lot of footage. There were logistical challenges, though, in and around him getting that material, because this was a seasonal film, snow was a problem. This was a winter story, and the production, well, it did a bit of a Die Hard too, in that it had to chase the snow around America a little bit. There was lots of waiting around while they waited for snow. As Nick de Semlin said in his book, there was a truck driver with a single line of dialogue who was kept on standby for so many days because of the weather that he was able to to make the down payment on a house with the overages that he was paid because of the extra days he was required. At one stage, the production gave up waiting for it to snow in Illinois, went off to Buffalo instead, and they were having to be quite nimble about their choices. Such was the ticking clock that this film was up against. Now, fortunately, Martin and Candy in the midst of this, they really got on and they really clicked. And after John Candy died in the 1990s, Martin has recorded really affectionate look back at his co-star in this film, and clearly there's a lot of warmth between the two of them. John Hughes too kind of knew what he had here, and he encouraged the improvisation between the pair of them. Hughes is notorious workaholic, worked late into the night, writing. When he was shooting, his days would go on for 13, 14 hours a day. He also had a habit of a director of not saying cut. That if actors were in the flow, he'd just let them carry on. Again, this is an era where cameras could hold about 12 minutes of film on a reel at a time. But what it meant was he just kept them going to see what material he got. He encouraged his actors to improvise. They'd throw out suggestions or little conversation points and let his actors go with it, and he would just keep watching them work and keep the cameras rolling. But it was said, in the midst of all the challenges it was up against, to be a happy set. What's interesting as well, I mean, the book Laughing on the Outside, which is another biography of Candy, notes this, that Steve Martin didn't mind that John Candy was effectively walking away with the picture, that he realised Candy was bringing in some of his best work on this particular film, and he was upstaging him in terms of some of the laughs, but he was happy for Candy to effectively take the lead, even though it's going to be Martin's name first and foremost on the poster. I think what John Candy does actually in this film is really, really, really difficult, because as kind of like the hanger-on character in a movie like this, it's really easy for the audience to instantly be against you. That there was a Melissa McCarthy, I think it's Identity Thief or something like that. There was a Melissa McCarthy comedy that came out a few years ago. I really like Melissa McCarthy. But it goes to how tricky it is to make this kind of role sympathetic to an audience, that even she couldn't pull it off. Whereas Candy does that here, and I think it's really something that he captures. Of course, I'm a huge Steve Martin fan, and that clip I played you right at the start is one of my favourite bits of Steve Martin delivery. Just the surgical precision of it is just genius. But then when assembling the film itself, John Hughes, once he'd wrapped up, he had a lot of editing to do, an awful lot of editing to do. In fact, the first rough cut of Planes, Trains and Automobiles was said to come in at around 4.5 hours in length, and Hughes obviously knew that had to be edited down, and edited it. There was reported at one stage to be a 3.5 hour cut, and I think Chris Columbus, in a Home Alone director, in an interview once said that he'd seen the longer version of Planes, Trains and Automobiles. It feels a bit Event Horizon to me, that there's infamously a lot of missing scenes from Event Horizon that have never been seen. In the case of Planes, Trains and Automobiles, the same. There's a lot of missing scenes that have never really had a public airing to them. To give an example, I mean, a couple of them have been talked about actually. There's a sequence where Michael McKean, playing a cop, pulls over Martin and Candy's characters in this one, and he talks on the supplements of the disc release about how that sequence in particular was supposed to be a lot longer, that they had a lot more information in that scene, because McKean's cop was supposed to tell the pair that they'd overshot Chicago by 100 miles, and that whole bit was cut out in post-production, and as McKean would say, it seems a lot more of a cameo role than it actually was. There was a sequence too featuring John Candy. I'm going very spoiler light, just to say that there is a moment where he drops a revelation about his wife in the movie, and he carried on talking. There was a lot more on set than we saw in the final movie, because he improvised some really quite somber stuff in an extension to that scene, which pointed towards the dramatic work that he was gradually edging more and more towards. I've discussed JFK on a previous Film Stories podcast, and that was a role that Candy was particularly nervous about, given that was the first part really he'd taken on in a high-profile movie that was straight drama. But yet the ingredients to building to that are both in Planes, Trains and Automobiles and on the cutting room floor of Planes, Trains and Automobiles. There's more sequences as well. There was a sequence that was shot in a strip club that disappeared. There was an extended sequence in a taxi cab, which I mean, there's a story that Hughes cut a separate 10-minute film of that none of it actually made it into the movie, and that kind of makes it feel. I don't know if you remember when the first Anchorman movie came out, and the DVD was accompanied by another movie edited together from all the material they didn't use in the original Anchorman. It sounds like that could have applied to Planes, Trains and Automobiles as well. Jerry Ryan, who played 7 of 9, I think, in Star Trek on the small screen, she gave an interview for SFF Chronicles where she said that she shot on the movie for 3 days, but kept getting the giggles at the 2 stars, and her material from the film was chopped, and she was ultimately fired from the film just because she couldn't keep a straight face around Candy and Martin when they were doing what they were doing. Disappointingly, with Planes, Trains and Automobiles, I mean, I've talked about the disc. I mentioned the disc once or twice, but I think there's 3.5 minutes of deleted scenes on that disc, and it's a sequence that takes place on a plane, and that is the only bit that we get, and it remains a disappointment that there's not a much more extended version of the movie out there. At the very least, a version that showcases a lot of the material that didn't make it to the screen. There was some controversy when it came to getting the film a rating. It's worth picking up on this as well, because whereas John Hughes films were generally regarded as teenage friendly, family friendly a little bit, there was nonetheless a particularly F-laden sequence in Planes, Trains and Automobiles. It's the moment where Steve Martin loses it, and I mean, it sticks out enormously in the film, and it's one of the many genius moments in there. But because of the use of the F word there, this is a movie that got an R rating in America off the back of that. In fact, it's rated still in the UK a 15 certificate for its strong language, and it is the only bit of the movie that lifts it into another bracket, but that you put your F-bombs in, that's the rating you're going to get. And so, I mean, Hughes, again, he talked about it in the press conference. He said they've not used it gratuitously. They screened the picture lots of times. No one was offended, and they pushed back about the rating from the Motion Picture Association of America, the MPAA. But the MPAA was adamant: you put your F-bombs in the film, you're getting an R rating, and that's why Planes, Trains and Automobiles ultimately had to play to a more adult audience. There is also one thing with this movie, in that it's one of the John Hughes movies of the era that doesn't have a title song to it, doesn't have an iconic song linked to it, that it's got music flowing right the way through it. But I dug up a Los Angeles Times report in 1987, from October 1987, so this is 1 month before the film's ultimate release. And I mean, that report confirmed that Elton John had actually been asked and was due to write the title song for Planes, Trains and Automobiles, but this all fell apart 2 days before he was due to record said song. That, to go with the Los Angeles Times report, to quote that a minute, it says Hughes Entertainment isn't talking, but Gary Osborne, writing the lyrics, told us that contractual technicalities was the cause. Osborne is quoted as saying, we'd seen and loved the film, the lyric was written, and Elton had almost finished the tune when we discovered Paramount wanted various things which were difficult to arrange. And this went in part down to Elton John's contract with Polygram at the time, whereby as soon as he'd completed a song and released a song, Polygram would own the rights to it. But it sounds like Paramount also wanted to own the rights to it, and this became a hurdle that it was impossible to negotiate. And because by the sounds of it, Paramount was playing hardball and it was very late in the day, it was too late to sort a contract out, and Elton John departed, leaving the film without that title song in it. The final cut of the movie, then, it came in at 92 minutes, and it was edited by Paul Hirsch, and he spoke to Pro Video Coalition about the editing of the film, and he talked about how basically they ended up taking more out of the film that they left in, that it shot for 85 days. John Hughes would shoot without cutting the camera, and it was on film, so that made it tricky as well. But Hirsch also revealed that Hughes, throughout the actual filming of it, was rewriting scenes the night before, handing the dialogue to Candy and Steve Martin, and the scenes would get longer and longer and longer. So going back to the original script, he said the scene in the taxi when they first drive to the first motel was about a third of a page. By the time it got to the end of that, and Hughes had done his rewrites and the improvisation had come in, Hughes had shot, according to Hirsch, 40,000 feet of film for a sequence in the movie that was supposed to say that was supposed to be just a third of the page. Hughes was shooting around 3 hours of footage every single day, and he was there was a further deadline I didn't mention before that it was up against, because there was a threat of a director's strike that year, which meant photography on the movie had to be wrapped up by the end of June. And once the end of June came, John Hughes went away for a 2-week holiday. He just shot 2 films back to back, and that's when Paul Hirsch brought in extra people. They had 4 people in the end having to cut the film to get some kind of first cut together. And then when Hughes came back refreshed and with new ideas, Hirsch would recall that in the first pass of going through it, Hirsch and Hughes, they took out a further third of the movie, including a whole subplot went straight out about Neil's wife not believing that he was really with John Candy's Dell. They did get to a point where they could test screen the movie, and I think that started at the end of August. They got it down to a 2-hour version, and Hirsch, again, to quote him, he said that they thought they had a really funny film, but people started walking out and they couldn't work out why. And Hirsch said it wasn't until the 4th preview that we figured out what the problem was, which was we'd thrown out a subplot about Candy and Steve's credit cards getting mixed up because we thought it was too complicated, so we just got rid of all of it. Without that, the audience thought that Candy was using Steve, getting him to pay for everything. He was a freeloader, so they started hating him. They hated Steve for being so easily manipulated, so they soured on both characters. And what they did is they found a shot at one of the train stations where Candy says to Steve Martin, "Give me your address and I'll send you some money." Putting that line back in turned the film around. The film made it to cinemas November the 25th, 1987, and was met by really positive reviews. And John Hughes films weren't really used to getting really positive reviews either. John Candy in particular was loudly applauded for his performance, many suggesting it was his best role at that point. Many have suggested it is his best role, full stop. And the movie too would go on to be a box office success as well, costing 30 million in the end to make. It would go on to gross around 50 million in the US. And the weekend that it opened, it actually opened in 3rd place, taking $7 million. This was in November 1987. That's a lot of money. To give you context of what else was around, the number 1 film that weekend, which had also opened at the same time, was 3 Men and a Baby. Disney's re-release of Cinderella was in 2nd, Fatal Attraction at 4. The Running Man had been number 1 the week before. That was down to 5. There was also Nuts, Flowers in the Attic, Teen Wolf 2, Dirty Dancing and Baby Boom, just fleshing out that particular top 10 of that week. For Hughes, he would, in the aftermath, obviously he'd go off and finish She's Having a Baby. He would then direct John Candy again in the film Uncle Buck in 1989. For Martin, he would go off and do Dirty Rotten Scoundrels with Michael Caine and then move on to Parenthood. Martin and Candy, though, we never got to see them again together on the big screen. More's the pity, really. We've since lost John Candy. We've since lost John Hughes. They left us behind, I would suggest, a very special film with this one. Which brings me to the halfway point of this latest episode of Film Stories. I am, if you don't mind me just asking, if you like this podcast, I am an independent producer. I sit in a room by myself, talk you into the best microphone I can afford. I have no big company behind me. As such, I rely on your word of mouth really to get the to get word of this podcast out. And thank you so much for all of you who've supported me. If you do like this podcast, please leave an ideally positive review at your podcast repository of choice, if you can subscribe to it as well. If you want to help support it financially, I'm at patreon.com/Simon Brew, and the money that I take there goes towards paying writers for the Film Stories website at filmstories.co.uk, and also I invest it into all the materials I need to research these podcasts. But that's enough of me asking for things. I'm going to get on with the second of the two stories I'm talking about in this week's episode. We're going to 2006. We're going to have a little bit of the Staith. Here's a clip.
My name is Chev Chelios, and today is the day that I die. But I'm getting a little ahead of myself. I've been poisoned with some kind of Chinese synthetic. You got to do something for me, Doc.
They gave you the Beijing cocktail. It's cutting off your adrenaline. If you stop, you die.
Now, I've got 1 hour to settle the score. Say goodbye to my girl, and go out with a little style. All I have to do is stay alive long enough to make it happen. Juice me.
Clear?
That's a clip from the entirely sane 2006 movie Crank, directed and written by Brian Taylor and Mark Neveldine, starring Jason Statham as Chev Chelios alongside Amy Smart, Jose Pablo Contilla, Efren Ramirez, Carlos Sanz, Reno Wilson. A quite extensive ensemble for this one, particularly for such an economic movie. So the story of this goes back to Mark Neveldine and Brian Taylor, the writers and directors of the movie, who, like many filmmakers before them, well, they'd started to cut their teeth in the world of commercials. However, they'd always had their eye on the movies, and in particular what they wanted to make was what they described as a non-stop action movie. A movie that was just like a video game, they said, and they set about just doing that. And they explained, with Crank, we wanted to do a movie where a guy was moving all the time. It's like Speed, as in the film, only instead of a bus, it's a guy, and if he slows down, he detonates. And that's exactly what they started to put together. And Taylor would say it gave us a built-in way to move the camera the way we like to move it, and to attack the world of the character the way we wanted to attack his world. I mean, notably, video games were a huge touch point for this movie, in particular the Grand Theft Auto games, which are still going and still wildly popular, and they wanted to capture something of the spirit of that in a big screen feature. So they cracked on with writing the first draft of the script, which was ready by the early 2000s. I think I managed to peg it to 2003. And they wrote it at this stage with Johnny Knoxville in mind, that this was Johnny Knoxville at the top of his Jackass fame. He hadn't crossed over to movies really at this point. But as Mark Neveldine told Deadspin, he said, we wrote it with him in mind, but when we made the offer, because William Morris Independent picked it up first, we went to Brad Pitt, and it seemed like Brad Pitt's team there quite liked it, but they all ultimately passed. And so no Johnny Knoxville, no Brad Pitt. Can you imagine Crank with Brad Pitt? Crikey. One person I can imagine Crank with was Nicolas Cage. He was certainly approached for the movie, but at this point he had other commitments, there was other stuff he was doing, and it was not to be. There's a story too that Chris Rock was approached about playing the role of Chev Chelios, because I mean, Neveldine and Taylor knew that this was a comedic role, and they knew what they needed was an actor to take the lead who could do a bit of comedy and a bit of action as well, and managed to pull it all off convincingly. So again, this went to Chris Rock's team. They weren't too sure of the film, and it's unclear whether it was Rock who passed or his team that passed. Bottom line was, Chris Rock was not going to star in Crank. Reportedly also in the mix was the mighty Gerard Butler, but he, I mean, for reasons he couldn't do it, and so as it turned out, Neveldine and Taylor would develop a project for him. They'd go on and make 2009's Gamer together, but in the case of Crank, it wasn't to be. So Brian Taylor talked to the How Did This Get Made podcast about Crank, and he said it was the first script that they wrote, and when they sent it out, they were getting lots of people coming back saying, this script's really cool, this is just the kind of film we should be making, we really love this. And then those very same people said, well, we can't make it, like to watch it, but someone else has got to make it. And there were I mean, if you've not seen Crank, it's very violent, there's very open sequence of let's just say public hanky panky, and it's a film that you could comfortably say lives on the edge a little bit. So, I mean, it got Hollywood interested in Neveldine and Taylor as filmmakers, but it didn't exactly have many studios reaching for their wallets. They were told, we're interested, have you got anything else? But the problem was they didn't have anything else. They'd put all their eggs in this particular cranky basket. So they decided to fight for their film. And it was a company called Lakeshore who changed the fortunes of Crank and ultimately brought the project to life. And the people there, Tom Rosenberg and Skip Williamson, well, they backed the film. And as Taylor would say, they embraced everything about it that everyone else was afraid of. And Lakeshore knew it had to be made cheaply, but also there was a path now to getting this movie made. Now, going back to one of those Lakeshore executives that I talked about, Skip Williamson. Now, he'd heard of the film in the first place through a friend of his, a man called Michael Shersky. And Shersky was an agent at William Morris, so they'd picked up on the script beforehand. But also, he happened to be the agent for Neveldine and Taylor at this point. And Neveldine and Taylor, off the back of their commercials work, they got a sizzle reel together to showcase some of what they'd been up to. And all of this made it to Skip Williamson. He got the sizzle reel, he was impressed, he then got sent the screenplay to Crank, and 20 pages in, he was pretty much sold. Now, the challenge of Crank was it was always trying to achieve an awful lot on quite a modest budget. And also Neveldine and Taylor were absolutely passionate about the fact that to realise the action in the movie, they wanted to do it in camera. They did not want this to be a CG film. The influences and touch points, that one of the key ones was George Miller's Mad Max The Road Warrior, the second Mad Max film. And the argument was, if it feels dangerous when you're shooting it, it's probably going to look dangerous on film. And that's certainly something that at least 3 of the 4 Mad Max films, for my money, capture. That's what they wanted to go for. With Lakeshore then interested and willing to write a cheque for the movie, Lionsgate came in. This was Lionsgate really before Hunger Games had transformed it, although Saw was starting to do a bit of work there. And so Lionsgate agreed to distribute the film as part of a deal with Lakeshore. And what happened then is Neveldine and Taylor would work with the Lakeshore team for a good 18 months before they actually started filming to get the movie into shape. What was clear was the pair were going to direct this. What was also clear was they were going to operate the cameras, they were going to have input into the lighting, also that they were just going to do loads of the jobs. Now that's not to undersell the many other people listed on the end credits of the film. It's just the fact that there were jobs that sometimes directors gave to other people that these two were going to do themselves. It was always envisaged too as being a Los Angeles based movie and to be an LA film. And Taylor explained this. He said one of the ideas of the movie is that it's quintessentially an LA movie, that LA's a character in the film. Now, I've heard, oftentimes you hear stories about how the film is a character. I remember when they're talking about Die Hard with a Vengeance, how New York's going to be a character in the film. But the geography of Los Angeles was going to be important to Crank, and that's why they also had to shoot the movie in LA. Now LA, we're talking the mid 2000s, and it's even more expensive now, well particularly in lockdown it is, but Los Angeles is not a cheap place to make a movie. There's a reason why the vast majority of American television series decamp to Vancouver in Canada to do their shooting, where the cost of filming is cheaper and you can make the area look a bit like Los Angeles or just a big American city anyway. They did, when it came to plotting where to shoot this particular film, they did explore other places other than Los Angeles to see if they could recreate what they were looking to get there. And Vancouver was on the list, Montreal was on the list, New Mexico was also listed as an alternative, but they also knew they had to, ultimately in their heart of hearts, they had to shoot the film in Los Angeles. They had to make it work on a budget in Los Angeles. This was going to be a guerrilla production, guerrilla with a U, whereby they just had to skate around figuratively and metaphorically the city to get the shots that they needed. In the midst of all this plotting, though, there was the small matter of casting the lead role of Chev Chelios. What a name. Now, they'd envisaged when they wrote the character an American in the lead. They were looking for, quote, the badass dudes of the ilk of Steve McQueen and the Roy Scheiders, those kind of people. Already they'd gone through people who couldn't do it, and it took a few Heinekens with Jason Statham, who had become aware of the project, to solve their key casting conundrum here. I should point out other lagers are available. Statham talks in the press notes of the movie, appreciating it's fairly promotionally blurred, but he says, not unreasonably, the screenplay was completely different from anything I'd ever read. Now, Statham had come to prominence at this point off Guy Ritchie directed features. He wasn't quite at the Fast and Furious level of movie star we know him as now, but he was making an awful lot of interesting and fun action movies. I'm a bit of a fan. And Statham said, I mean, it's crazy. It's beyond crazy. There were so many great scenes. It was so full of violence, romance, comedy, drama. It's kind of 10 movies in one. And so the directors showed Statham their sizzle reel, and then they went through how they wanted to do the film and explained it all in detail to him. And Statham was nervous by the fact that he'd never done comedy, and this is something he'd come up against when he made Spy with director Paul Feig, which I'll come to in a future Film Stories podcast. He knew his way around action. There was no way that he didn't know his way around action. This movie was happening. Statham was on board. One person who didn't know action, that was Amy Smart, and she was cast in the co-lead role of Eve, and this would be her first action movie. The rest of the ensemble came together fairly quickly, and then it was time to make the movie on a $12 million budget. Filming then would begin in the autumn of 2005, and the decision had been made fairly early to shoot the movie on digital rather than on film. They were going to use a Sony HD camera for this one, and it's worth noting that this is the infancy of movies shooting on digital, that the quality to that point hadn't been particularly renowned for being that high, and it was always seen as a bit of a gamble to shoot your movie on a digital video camera. I mean, another Statham movie, The Bank Job, would make quite big advances in this area. Again, I've discussed that on a previous podcast. So they brought in a man called Nick Theodorakis to ensure that the digital footage was up to scratch. And I mean, he's talked about this process. He described how Neveldine and Taylor were big video fanatics. And he said that's sort of refreshing, because most of the time when I shoot high definition with people, they're shooting HD maybe because they can't afford film, or they view it as something that should just look like film. And he said, however, here are two young guys that actually grew up on video and look on it as an art form in itself, which is great because we could develop a look that's not quite film and not quite traditional video or HD. But there were problems with the equipment they were using and what level it was at in the mid-2000s, because the Sony 950 cameras they were using came with power leads. And so they had to innovate a little bit, and they came up with something called a nanocam, which was described as a backpack that enabled Neveldine to hold a disassembled piece of the camera, the lens and an image plate in his hand, while the rest of the camera, deck and battery belt stayed firmly strapped to him from behind. The way they were shooting the movie too was this was going to have long scenes where the character Chelios in the same scene will go from indoors to outdoors and vice versa, which would change the lighting dynamic required, and that meant that the team had to adjust the lighting on the fly, that they needed to be able to instantly review footage and change things pretty much on the spot. Not that the directors weren't there in the thick of it all, of course, because you had Neveldine and Taylor who were both operating cameras themselves. This was very hands-on stuff. And so one of them would do the wide shots, the other would go in for the close-ups. And I mean, every little detail in there, really. When an actor is on the phone, they're really on the phone. They weren't using much in the way of filmmaking tricks here. They were shooting it as real as they could possibly do. And that went to the stunts as well. I mean, as you might might expect. Jason Statham did his own stunts for the film, and there's one that had him just hanging from a helicopter well over the streets of Los Angeles. And Statham was up for this. He wanted to go up into the helicopter, and as Brian Taylor would say, we weren't sure if legally we were allowed to do it, but we had the best stunt guy on the planet, Darren Prescott, on board, and he brought all the right tools and made it happen. And Statham's talked in the past about just how hairy that particular stunt was, but it was really important to get it, and he was really proud that they managed to get it in the can in the way that they did. Statham was also drawn to the unpredictable nature of the directors, that he would turn up day to day on the shoot and never quite know exactly what he was going to get, that they would always come up and improvise crazy action stuff for Statham to do. Then of course there's the very public nookie scene as well, and it was all shot frantically and covered by 2 cameras, and very much all in a style particular to the movie. Now, if you've ever had the pleasure of seeing Crank, and it really is a pleasure, the action sequences have a really kinetic quality to them, but then that again goes back to the guerrilla way, again with a U, in which Neveldine and Taylor would shoot the footage. That Neveldine would put on a pair of rollerblades and film action with a handheld camera, would get up to 30, 40 miles per hour to keep up with what was going on. And Statham would say they have this great freestyle way of shooting things, that using this new generation of camera equipment allows them to get into places you never think of putting a camera, because the cameras were small, certainly by the standards of film cameras at the time. I mean, they've got a lot smaller since, but Statham would say, I'm driving along and they're sticking a camera between my legs. It's just so freeform. That's one way to describe it, Jace. I've never seen anything like it. He says, for me, the best experiences are working with people that have written it and can direct it. I never thought they'd operate the camera as well. Their talent is kind of endless. They certainly had an absolute vision for what this movie was going to be, and the way they shot it and the way they put it together, well, that very much went to that vision that they'd originally put together, that they knew what they wanted this film to turn out like, and they were consistently building to that whilst improvising and building extra sequences because of the on-the-fly nature of the way that they were shooting it all. The film then wrapped up shooting, and Neveldine and Taylor put together their cut of the movie, which was going to come in, I think it was 88 minutes in the end. I mean, it's quite a brief action extravaganza you get for your money here, but I don't think many people were shortchanged. Then there was, how on earth do you get a film like this noticed? So first of all, it's worth noting that there was a little bit of pressure from the studio just to cut 1 or 2 elements of the film. Most notably, the sex scene in Chinatown was one that the directors were leaned on a little bit. There was some nimbleness about how they went about getting the word out about Crank, though, because Lionsgate didn't have a huge marketing budget for this, and so it needed to embrace the guerrilla, again with a U, spirit of the whole production. And so in 2006, it wasn't commonplace you'd do a huge Comic-Con presentation, but Lionsgate did this panel which was key to the promotion, and it got across the message that was coming across in the Comic-Con panel that was showcased in the summer of 2006 was this was a film without wires, without CG. Neveldine and Taylor said we couldn't afford them anyway, even if we wanted them. This was I'm loath to say an old-fashioned practical film, because it clearly isn't in the way that they shot it, but also it was playing down the values, playing up to the values of you do all this in camera. Lionsgate was also using the internet extensively to promote the movie. Again, even at this point, studios tended to use a balance of more traditional advertising methods as well as the web, but it's pretty well known that Lionsgate, for instance, invested in YouTube to help promote the movie, and they were placing spots on a lot of popular websites, all building up to the September 2006 release for the film. And they gave it quite a wide release, really, as well. It went out on 2,500 screens in America on September the 1st, and what do you know, the film was something of a box office hit. The critical response to it was pretty mixed. I think it's fair to say you either go with Crank or you don't, but the general response was this is worth seeking out. And for a low budget film, the audience pretty much agreed that it would open in America across the Labor Day weekend of 2006, that its 4-day opening gross was $12.8 million. It just narrowly beat out the other film that's around for opening that week weekend. Nicolas Cage in the remake of The Wicker Man, that was in third with 11 million. There was a third movie as well, Invincible from Disney, the sports movie, that actually topped the box office with 15 million, but that had less scenes of public nookie in. Crank would go on to gross $27.8 million in the US. It would add another 15 million overseas for a worldwide gross of $43 million. But crucially, this was also the era where DVD was booming as well. And the DVD went down very well, brought in another stack of cash, and that opened the door to a sequel. And that sequel would be Crank High Voltage, that would see Statham return in the role of Chev Chelios. I won't tell you the tagline because it might be a spoiler for the end of the first movie, but I think the tagline to the second Crank movie is really quite glorious. That sequel would shoot again in Los Angeles, again in the same style for 31 days in all, but it didn't go down as well, really. That it cost a little bit more to make and took a little bit less at the box office, and the reviews weren't quite as strong either. Nonetheless, there's consistently been talk of a third Crank film. There was at one point it was going to be Crank 3D. Brian Taylor and Mark Neveldine are certainly open to another Crank, and I had the opportunity to interview Jason Statham when Spy came around, and I asked him about that, and he was keen to do it as well. The problem was that Crank 2 hadn't made as much profit as the first film, and trying to make a third Crank movie in the current movie making climate, and that's even before COVID, where the expectations for box office returns needed to be higher, that was always going to be difficult. As a consequence, it looks unlikely that we'll ever see another Crank movie. The fact that the first one exists at all is down to basically Neveldine and Taylor and a particular vision for what they wanted to do. They've since gone on to do Ghost Rider Spirit of Vengeance in 2011. Gamer, as I mentioned before, came out the same year as Crank High Voltage. They've done Pathology in 2008. Taylor's since gone on as well to do to work with Nicolas Cage on Mum and Dad. But Crank 3, if they are by any chance listening, please just take it that there is still enthusiasm for the movie out there. I, for one, would love to see Chev Chelios back on the big screen. Which brings me to the end of this latest episode of Film Stories. As always, thank you so much for listening. You can find more of my waffle on Twitter at Simon Brew. You can find a load more stuff on our website, actually, filmstories.co.uk, which is updated every weekday with loads of news stories. We put new features up there, reviews, all sorts of bits and bobs. It's a clickbait-free website, and hugely appreciate your support of that. The Film Stories Project is on Twitter at FilmStoriesPod. You can find us on YouTube, youtube.com/filmstories, where we've got video exclusive stuff on there as well. Facebook at facebook.com/filmstoriesonline. And at the point this podcast is being recorded, I am working on the 21st issue of Film Stories magazine, of which more information will be on our website soon. You can find more on that at store.filmstories.co.uk, where we've also got an array of Christmas gift subscriptions and bits and bobs like that, which would be pretty much useless if you like listening to this in March or something like that. But the subscriptions will still be available. They'll just be less Christmassy. As always, the most important thing, though, is that you all stay safe and stay well. Thank you, as always, for your support. Thank you for listening. I'll be back with you soon with another bunch of film stories. Take care. Bye-bye.